Thank you. Hi, everyone. If you're watching the stream, if you're watching from, well, I guess mainly the stream, or if you're one of the judges, welcome to the grand final of this year's World University Spinning Championships. My name is Tek Wei, and I'm the chair for the round. My nickname on the tab is Within the Debate, as made popularized by myself. And joining me on the panel, we have a number of really distinguished judges. So representing us from the CA team, and in time-honored tradition with nicknames of their own, we have Juanita, Where is the Draw, Hincapi Restrepo, and Nolutando, nicknames, really, Honono. But also we have a number of other judges who I want to celebrate because of their excellent performance to this point. And so joining me on the panel are Lucy Samova, Pranav Kagalkar, Tamki Nawab, Uday Kamath, Ilya Ivanisevich, and Emery Taylor. We are not the stars of the show. Those would be the four teams ahead of us. And so I'd like to give a big welcome to our four teams contesting the grand final. In opening government, we have Ateneo de Manila A. In opening opposition, we have BRAC A. In closing government, we have Princeton B. And in closing opposition, we have NUS A. I'd like each team to just take a moment to introduce themselves, express their preferred gender pronouns if you would like to, and just put yourselves out there for everyone to celebrate you and know that you've existed, that you're here in this grand final, which can be hard to do when you're online, but definitely not impossible. So once again, in opening government, Ateneo de Manila, we'd like to do some introductions.
Hi, I'm David. Speaking first, I have no preferred gender pronouns. I'm great, nice debating. Let's go.
Hello, my name is Miko. I'll be speaking second. I have no preference as well. And yeah, go debating.
In opening opposition, once again, BRAC A.
Hi, my name is Sajid. I'll be speaking first, no preferences.
Hi, my name is Shoradip. I'll be speaking second, no preference in pronoun. Best of luck to everyone.
In closing government, Princeton B.
Greg speaking first, he please.
And in closing opposition, NUS A.
Hi, Dion going first, no preference.
Hi, Sean going second, no preference.
Great. Well, without further ado, I think that's everything we need to do. Wish all teams the best of luck, have a great deal of fun. And to open up the debate, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister. Here.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yep.
All right, just give me 1 second to get everything in place. I had to turn off the aircon because it is making a whooshing noise that, it probably won't impede the speech, but it's a little annoying. Okay. This is not my actual background. Okay. POIs in the chat. I will start my speech in 3, 2, and 1. The world's reliance on the dollar is unquestionably a bad thing. It has exposed the global economy to systemic risk time and time again, and moreover has made it hard for countries to employ policies that are needed for crisis response for their individual economies that will have different requirements from the dollar. In this speech, first we will do some setup. So the dollar currently manifests its global reliance in 3 ways. 1, it is the main currency of international reserve. It is a store of value by which you use to shore up your government's income, and generally it's also used primarily for international transactions. It's also, secondly, the main currency of lending, and thirdly is that a very large amount of countries have either accepted it as their currency directly or pegged their currency to the dollar in some form. We want to highlight that as an historical note, this was not a consensual activity. For many of the poorest of the poor whom we made poor, this was a requirement for Bretton Woods institutes in order for them to provide you loans in order to uplift you out of poverty. This is a dramatic decline in autonomy for currency in the global economy. What will it be replaced by? We think there are a variety of plausible options individual nations' central banks will use to determine the value of their own currency. We think they will likely peg it to a variety of other things when they need strength, or leave it floating if they feel comfortable in its stability. It's possible that they peg it to a basket of other currencies, potentially the RMB, the yen, the pound, the euro, or they peg it to a commodity that is vital to their industry like gold. We don't have to explain only one, but that it is far far better to have the plausibility or the optionality of other options. Why is this likely to manifest in this way, where countries have choice and not where they're forced to pick one other option? This is because the decline currently manifests as the current global tightening cycle, pushing for countries to replace their reserves gradually, because of the fact that obviously it's introducing massive amounts of risk to their own country, and price stability is in shambles for most countries around the world. So essentially, the current global tightening cycle is something that countries want to opt out of or try and avoid, and they will try and slowly replace their international reserves with a variety of their options. And this also aligns with existing efforts of a broader international push for a long time to substitute the dollar or augment it with other countries' currencies, like the IMF special drawing rights, for example. We think these other options will be expanded in order to allow countries to have it. So we just think this is likely because it's obviously best, it's safest and stablest for these countries, and just their existing efforts that we think they can capitalize on already. Two arguments in this speech. First of all, systemic risk. How is systemic risk introduced by a global reliance in the dollar? The US is one of the most deregulated financial sectors in the world, exposed to significant lobbying from large groups since the Reagan era to consistently expose it to financial shock in the 90s, in the 2000s, all the way to now. Countries, specifically the central bank in the US, has to cater to these institutions, as particularly the revolving door in the Federal Reserve, where they go back into industry and benefit off of the chaos that they've made. Right now, even during COVID, we've not felt it, but so many firms are over-leveraged, banks giving out precipitous amounts of non-performing loans, and countries that are pegged or dependent on the dollar are exposed to this risk. Why does this risk manifest? Because of the world's global reliance on the dollar, and why does it expand to other countries? Typically, because everyone's currency is related to their international reserves, and they have to settle things like imports and exports in dollar, they have to convert the dollar, price stability is reliant on dollar, and all these things. Generally speaking, when the US goes down or when the US experiences harm, all these other countries experience harm due to the contagion effect of the dollar. So the counterfactual would be, presuming that you believe our alternative, the countries are substantially more autonomous. This gives them a variety of other options. Number one, they have the ability to hedge currency risk. So if the US has experienced substantially more price instability, then they're able to hedge it to other currencies like the euro or the yen. Moreover, this crisis response is also particularly tailored to their side. So maybe if they're okay with, the currency inflating and the currency going down, they can stick with some mixture of currencies that is best for them. But moreover, the ability for you to hedge in the first place also improves the confidence that many investors have in emerging economies and emerging markets. Finally, I just also want to point out that crisis response on opposition side is very, very expensive and very, very difficult, because they're forced to pay back these goods, they're forced to pay back these loans, and they're forced to pay back price stability by forcing down their individual local currencies in dollars, which can get very, very expensive, particularly if it's a developed economy that's already quite, if the US is a developed economy that's already quite rich. So what is the harm of exposing the world to systemic risk? I mean, I think this should be a little bit obvious that most countries around the world do not like experiencing systemic risk, and as a direct consequence, they are most likely to experience things like economic collapse when the US experiences it well. The counterfactual, obviously, is that the US would have that crisis of currency, or the crisis of reliance on the dollar solely confined to that country as well, or at the very least, the shock waves of that would be slow enough such that other countries would be able to adjust. Moreover, other countries are hamstrung in their ability to respond to this economic crisis, so it will make it substantially cheaper for them to adopt. This is a gigantic amount of impacts towards people on the ground. It means that they're more able to pay for food. It means that price stability means investors stay in the country, foreign direct investments and flee the country. Essentially, people don't starve, and as a direct consequence, economies are structurally stabler and happier for the future and the long term. I'll move on to the second argument, that even if the US is not exposed to systemic risk, just that the US has a very, very drastically different economic strategy and monetary approach to things means that other countries have a much harder time surviving and doing well. But before that, I'll take a PY from CO.
Okay, I think it's soft debating to say that there are a host of other alternatives. What is the most likely thing for specific countries to take? So if you're a country near China, what do you think their foreign currency reserve will look like?
The basket option, because they don't want to hedge so much. So presumably, if they think it's a bad idea to put all their money in China, you might make arguments to that effect, then they will likely put some money in the yen as well, maybe the pound. So, moreover, we also think secondarily, it is much harder for countries to enact an economic strategy that is best for their country. It is difficult for them to pay for their debts because the dollar is much more expensive. Some countries will want to increase the value of their currencies to import, while others will want to decrease the value of their currency to export. This affects the price of goods in their country, essentially jettisoning price stability in their country. A good example of this is the US announcing gigantic rate hikes recently and forcing central banks all over Asia to follow with rate hikes of their own, leading to massive outflows of foreign investment, businesses collapsing and unable to survive unnecessary loans in times of crisis because the US was ready for rate hikes, but other countries were not. This forces essentially macroeconomic tightening cycles all around the world if they don't want their currency to collapse in terms of price, because the fact that their price stability is itself pegged to the dollar already, which will have necessarily different directions in terms of monetary policy and fiscal policy than other countries will, just because their economies are functionally different when it comes to the approach that they take to importing or exporting. This means that it's difficult for them to change the value of their currency when America takes the opposite direction, which will make their approach useless and potentially even lead to things like stagflation, where they get the worst of both worlds, and they might need to take additional measures like going into further debt, which will worsen the economic crisis potentially for the future. Not all countries may make good decisions, sure, but for the countries that have a corrupt and incompetent central bank, very little will actually change. But for the vast majority of countries where all the incentives are there to not get fired, to keep the economy stable, and they kick in, they are hamstrung by their reliance on the dollar. What is the broad impact of this argument? It means, number one, the poorest of the poor, who are very, very different from the economy in the United States, are least likely to be able to provide for foreign direct investment for their country. They're least likely to be able to keep investors in, which means that the availability of services like basic access to electricity, water, food, etc., because of the loss of price stability, as well as the loss of ability to control your own economy, as well as just the loss of the ability to keep the economy in the direction that keeps them here, means that people on the ground are again substantially more exposed to risk, are substantially reduced in terms of access to benefits and quality of life. It means, on the whole, the global reliance on the dollar has made things worse for everyone, and that's why we support its change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite the next speaker, the leader of the opposition, to open up the opposition case. Yeah.
Can I be heard very clearly?
Yep.
Just a sec. Before I start my speech, just want to say a huge shout out to all the people supporting us from Bangladesh. We've been showered with a lot of love. We're a small community that tries really hard to do well at this debating thing, and I'm sure this is just the beginning of a wonderful journey. And secondly, I know I'm representing BRAC now, and I'm really proud of that. But a huge shout out to the institution that has looked after me and Shordit for the longest time, and that's IBADU. This one's for you guys as well. Thank you very much. Cool. Timer. Have your phone? No, my phone is a bit of a. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We won't be soft. The first thing I'd like to point out is the current economic crisis that is happening because the dollar has strengthened is due to a host of other factors that are external to the US economy. Things like COVID and the supply shock it has created, things like the Ukraine war that is intertwined with the way in which demand and supply globally has impacted the economy, has meant that a lot of the things that you see as a symptom now have deeper reasons behind it. So I don't think illustrations of just suffering right now is good enough reason of this motion passing. We also prefer that the dollar is used by all countries around the world. We're happy to defend the norm of things like SWIFT or things like preferring credit cards from Visa instead of Chinese Union Pay. I'll talk about 3 broad things. First, why dollar is inherently less volatile than any other currency when pegged against. Secondly, why one currency within your foreign currency reserve, i.e. the dollar, is better than fracturing it into a basket of reserves, which opening government would like to defend. Third, why pegging against the dollar is an important foreign policy tool that we ought to give the United States. First, why is dollar inherently more stable? The first thing I'd like to posit is the US democratic system has the biggest checks and balances that make sure that the dollar has a floating value that is stable and predictable. There are 3 reasons under this. Number 1, the US is the biggest economy in the world where it has diversified into primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors. So you have things like oil in primary and machines in secondary, or even service sector in the tertiary, all of which means it is by far the most diversified economy where its currency, if you peg against, means you have inherently less risk. Number 2, democratic checks and balances. The political institutions, the autonomy of the central bank, all are inherently more prone within the United States. The only thing OG says against this is our regulation has failed for a period of time. But even that, we've seen a lot of that removed because of the failures of 2008 and the recession it has caused. This is because the political system allows for you to recognize why you suffered at that point in time, hold politicians accountable, and have conversations about how you can best mitigate that crisis going forward, which is why a lot of regulation happened post 2008, simply because the institutions of the United States are stronger than anywhere else. Third, assuming all of this is not true, and maybe there is some level of lobbying that happens within the United States, predictability of the United States is far higher. Why is predictability important? This is because currency value is often based on hedging and on speculation. So the fact that you have access to information from a very free-floating economy and indices like S&P 500, or the fact that politicians are actively challenging each other and talking and discussing about where the economy is headed, or there are two really powerful political parties that are always going against each other, means there's always access to information for you to access and understand where this currency is going. Why is this comparatively worse in their world? The first thing I'd like to posit is small countries are unlikely to be rational actors as they themselves would like to posit. This is because countries are nothing but an amalgamation of politicians who want to gain power within these small countries, who also have weaker institutions than the United States. What this means is when you have promises from Russia or China of really good economic inflow in the short term that puts you in power, you as an actor are often likely to trade off long-term economic risk, because at that point in time, when your tenure is over, it's something you don't need to care about. That's why a lot of these small countries around China have systematically sided with them. The difference is because the norm is you have to still use or peg yourself against the US dollar, your foreign currency reserve was not based on yuan or rubles. What this means is pressures from big actors means you might still end up with one other currency as your foreign currency reserve, except it'll be a far riskier economy that you're pegged against. First, because China and Russia are artificially controlled by their government. The currency float is artificially controlled, which means, although best case scenario, you just don't have information. How many of us know what the Chinese government is thinking, or what Putin is thinking, or what his next step will be? That breeds uncertainty and risk that makes your currency far more unstable. Number two, there's less ability for you to hold this government accountable in those cases. Even if the alternative is the European Union, maybe that is an alternative. It's unclear why that is. A federal state where the United States has control over budgets of different states and its problems means you're more able to control risks within that. But EU can't control what the Greek government does, which inherently breeds more risk. The first argument proves inherently it is likely the foreign currency reserve will be on one currency instead of many. And when that happens, the US is inherently a better actor, and therefore the US dollar is something we prefer. Second argument, fracturing. We think that there's an increasing likelihood that you will peg your currency in a way in which is really random, which means, so evidence of the fact that India wants to trade in Indian rupees while Russia wants to trade in Russian rupees. The first reason is the failure of the dollar breeds insecurity. You don't know what the next big economy is. Is it Russia? Is it China? It's hard to often predict where the economy will be 5 years down the line. The second is oftentimes there are ways in which you're caught in the struggle of politics. That means you have to have different actors cater to at the same time. What this means is, on a worst case, you will irrationally pick different currencies and put that as part of your basket. Why is this really bad? The first reason is, when you have reserves in different kinds of currencies, you often make sure trade becomes more difficult with countries that don't have the basket in those same amount of currencies. So say country A pegs its reserves based on rubles, country B pegs its reserve based on yuans. The fracturing, or the way you diversify that basket, inherently creates more risk when you have to trade with each other, because the conversion steps happen at an extra layer. So you first convert to yuan, then you convert to rubles, then you convert to the country you're trading with. What this ultimately means is you have less free trade between countries. Before that, I'll take a POI from closing.
If the Chinese economy is that unstable, wouldn't countries be more likely to choose the euro than they would the yuan?
First, you need to explain the incentives of EU to diversify to the same extent as China. Second, the politicians within these small countries and the way they interact. That's analysis that you're missing. So the first thing I'd like to posit is free trade becomes far more difficult when there are more layers in the conversion process of currencies. What this means is comparative advantage shrinks. The alternative that we defend is one US dollar that inherently allows everyone to trade with each other, that minimize the costs of international trade and allows you to specialize, which improves your ability to export and import and have efficiency among economies. So fracturing in and of itself is a bad thing. Lastly, this is a tool that the US uses as a tool of global politics. So the fact that all countries have dollars pegged to it allows the US to sanction countries like Russia. Why is this important, and why is this an actor that we want internationally? First, US has internal accountability versus any other actor. It has a diversity of minorities that care about global issues because they're from those countries or have families there, or they consist of educated liberals that care about external issues. Chinese populations or Russian populations are unlikely to do so to a greater degree. Further reasons for this in DLO, but it's evidently clear that the dollar is less risky than the alternatives. Very glad to oppose.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for opening government.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yep.
All right, great. One moment. All right, let's put on my coat. Whew. All right, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. First, on the stability of the dollar. On face, I want you to note that the stability of the dollar does not mean that the economic interests of the US necessarily match those of all the other nations that are pegged or use the dollar. I.e., even if the dollar is stable, the fact that they want to increase the value of their currency, whereas many developing nations seek to decrease the value of their currency in order to increase the attractivity of their exports, means that just because it is stable does not mean it is preferable. And all the reasons that they give on opening opposition as to why it's so difficult to change, and it is up to the political interests within the US, make it such that the autonomy that these individual nations have are never going to be accessed on their side of the house. Stability does not equal to benefit. Secondly, they say, what do you peg it to? And that all these other countries are for some reason so stupid and irrational, and therefore they'll just pick whatever comes their way. The first thing I want to note is that if this is the context opening opposition wants to deal in, any kind of economic policy they pursue is not likely to be very smart, and therefore the change is marginal on either side of the house. But in the instances that these economies have independent central banks, have shared economic interests, and oftentimes economies are the main ways in which politicians win an election anyway and to be able to determine their stability, it is unclear to me why it is so. First, the diversification of currency argument makes no sense. If you peg it to the value of the basket of currencies, you have to convert on every individual currency in order to make trade. You can just do it with the country you're trading with. It is a matter of the value. But secondly is, what do they peg it to? Not only do they purely assert they make bad decisions with whom they're going to peg it to, but secondly is, I think their assumptions of you just peg it to China, you'll peg it to Russia are uncomparative. Not only have these historically been the nations that are the most lax with respect to economic trade, have imposed the least restrictions with respect to giving loans, and therefore are unlikely to be the ones that force you into this kind of negotiation. But secondly is, in a global decline where all these countries maybe seek economic interest in being able to have you peg your currency to them, I would say you restart a competitive process in which in order for countries to convince you to be able to take on their currency or to be able to put them within your basket, it is much more likely that favorable trade negotiations, investment within your country and the inflow of capital, and being able to ensure the start of specific industries in this country is how they are managed to do that. The important nuance here is that the point in which the dollar was widely adopted was around like the 30s, 40s in order to ensure the widespread of the Bretton Woods institutions, and oftentimes is a period after World War II where economies were entirely desperate. I would say the context and status quo where there's likely more leverage and autonomy for these nations is where they are much more likely to be able to make a smart decision about this. So they cannot pick such a convenient context and say this is going to be all the countries and therefore we win the debate. That is not the case. Thirdly, they say this is an important tool within international relations. The first thing I want to be able to note is that it is unclear to me why the unhampered power of America to be able to make significant decisions with respect to economic sanctions and how they work is a good tool within politics. The first thing I want to be able to note is that while some countries, or especially powerful nations, can afford sanctions, there are many other nations that are smaller and are unable to meaningfully impact the nature of sanctions, make a country as big as Russia budge, but are more likely to ensure that they feel the effect of those sanctions, such that they have less trade, they have less imports, etc. So So it is not a winning game for a lot of these smaller nations, where they have such minimal impact on this country, but at the same time, they take on the brunt of increased tariffs, they take on the brunt of increased prices of imports, etc. And therefore, that is not fair for them. But secondly, I don't think that's a good thing. I think if America wanted to impose widespread sanctions on another nation, it is much better to be able to force that through international and multilateral organizations, or being able to build consensus within all of these different countries. Because it is impossible for me to believe that American international relations and their interests are always positive in nature. A lot of the time, they have sanctioned regimes that, or rather, they have sanctioned nations that have simply disagreed with them and favored other authoritarian regimes with a lot or significant amounts of hypocrisy. It is impossible for me to believe that just being able to do this is much better than being able to choose from a myriad of alternatives coming from open government. What am I going to argue in extension? I want to explain why the shift of many global economies to trade and labor exportation towards the US has led to significant amounts of exploitation for a lot of developing economies. But before I move on, I'll take the PY from closing opposition.
Yeah, Miko, in a world where these current countries are using smaller currencies and a variety of smaller currencies, doesn't that decrease the amount of information and stability to get out each of the choices that they're making?
That's first of all unclear to me as to why that decreases the amount of information. But secondly, insofar as you have more choices of that currency, I think it is much better for you to be able to do so. Yeah, in fact, I would just make the argument that this gives incentives for mutual stability of the economies of other countries, insofar as you don't have to rely on just the US being stable, but also ensuring surrounding economies you trade with are also stable. And therefore, the amount of investment that is mutual within countries, the amount and their ability to loan and be able to give to each other in periods of economic crisis increases as well. How have countries reacted to the dependence on the dollar? I think it's a couple of things. Firstly, they've significantly redirected trade to either the US or US like dollar using economies. And the importance of that is that while I think this is a fair decision to make, it is the decision that should be made on how much can you sell your goods for? How much are you able to ensure that they will have a large market and therefore buy your products? Because there are many other good options for them to pick, like Europe, like China, etc., in order for them to be able to export their goods. But the reason they do this is because the large dependence on the dollar means that you need a significant amount of foreign currency reserves in US dollar in order to keep your economy afloat. And what that entails is you have to shift the way your economy works in order to receive those kinds of foreign currency reserves, rather than what might be most strategic for your economy as a consequence. So that means that when trade could have been more favorable for you, when you likely could have had a greater ability to determine your policy, you were unable to do that because you need the dollar as a consequence. And this has also significantly impacted the ability of loaning institutions in order to ensure that you are also receiving US dollars and loans, but you also cannot inflate the value of your currency in order to pay those loans off. And therefore, the power, the coercive power of the IMF and of the World Bank, as more and more countries sign on, gets more and more powerful as well. And what they have often entailed are neoliberal policies that favor exportation to the US to the detriment, or exportation from the US to the detriment of building up local industry. But lastly, and the reason this is also bad, is that many developing economies have shifted to the exportation of talented and important labor from their countries to work in the US. And that's important because the way they do, the reason they do that is because they want remittances from the wages they get to go back to their home country. And that's a bad thing, because for many developing economies, what you need is skilled and talented labor to build up industries, to move from manual labor and primary industries to more secondary service-based tertiary industries. But when they instead leave your country and compete in the US, not only do they not necessarily live better off lives because there's a greater amount of competition, you strip away developing economies of their way in which they can develop by diversifying industry, improving the nature of their economy because they needed the dollar. I'm very, very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. To conclude the top half, I'd like to welcome the DLO here.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes and yes.
Thank you so much. Just before starting, just a disclaimer that given I work in this line, my opinions are not reflected in this speech. It's just within the requirements of competitive debating. But also at the same time, as Sajid shouted out to the Bangladeshi community, I'd like to shout out to the Asian and the Australian community for making me feel like one of their own. Really incredibly grateful for that. With that being said, I'm going to start this debate. The reason open government is out of this debate is because in DPM, they claim stability is not preferable. 3 reasons why this is not true. Number one, if stability is something that we already have under our side, which they have conceded to a certain extent, by the way, means that a stable currency is much easier to to hold a standard against. So for example, controlling your currency against one stable currency is far easier. So for example, if you want to devalue your currency in that particular sense, it's easier to control it and hedge it against the US dollar, because then you don't have to care about how the yuan is moving or the euro is moving or the pound is moving and so on and so forth. One standard is much better in terms of stability and so on and so forth. Secondly, markets are far more predictable, right? When you are trading with a particular country, when different companies are trading with each other, when you have a basket of currencies within your reserves and you do not know which sort of a currency that you're going to get from that particular country, it's far harder to predict the value of goods and so on and so forth. This is incredibly important, because if you don't know the value of goods, you wouldn't know how much to order. If you don't know how much to order, your ability to trade with other countries, smaller countries that opening government is so concerned about, goes down at that particular point in time, because of the simple reason that you do not have markets, currency markets that are as predictable anymore. You're more likely to trade with countries with more stable economies rather than countries which has certain advantages such as low labor costs and so on and so forth, which is very important under our side, because that's how they achieve economic growth and so on and so forth. Number three, and this is also to a certain extent integrated within stability and so on and so forth. They said that, oh, but every country now caters to the US. But literally, like, no, like every other country trades with every other country on the basis of reserve currency, because of the fact that every country in the world has a dollar reserve. Even freaking Russia has a dollar reserve, which has been frozen. That's a different story. But even Russia has a dollar reserve, means that you can trade with any other country in the world, because you can use the predictability of the US dollar to hedge against. So for example, when Zambia wants to trade with Rwanda, they can use a dollar as a convertibility in between these two currencies. In a world where you hedge against that particular currency basket, that becomes far more difficult to do. Why is the currency basket so bad? Because I think CG will probably have to defend it based on the rules of debating and so on and so forth. I'll give you 4 broad reasons why. And rebuttals integrated. Number one, they said that the dollar is not good because they, like, regulations and so on and so forth do not exist. Untrue. After 2008, we have the Dodd-Frank Act and so on and so forth. The US has become far more sort of sensible in terms of financial regulations. Secondly, they said that on net, the US economy and the US financial system is deregulated. We tell you it's a good thing that it's on net deregulated. What are the alternatives that you have? You have China, that is not deregulated, that is the financial system is heavily hedged against its housing market, which can bust at any point in time because the housing construction across the world can go down, and that market itself can go down at any point in time because the construction companies of China are not making profits currently. Secondly, it's captured by oligopolies on the alternative. If you have a deregulated market, you have more competition, you have more, and it's easier to enter into the market. Like companies such as Lehman Brothers can just be not bailed out and shoved out of the market because it's possible to do so, because they're not an oligopoly that have captured the entire US market, because it's a deregulated market, which is not possible in other major economies. You can say, but the euro is great and so on and so forth. For number one, the euro is a far smaller economy. Two, euro has very similar structures with US. It's basically a budget US at that point in time. Why do you want to complicate things with the euro and so on and so forth? Number three, it also has countries such as Greece, Portugal, and Italy with far worse balance sheets within their economies and have different regulations all across, not a standardized form of regulations. Standardized form of regulations are important in order to have some predictability within financial markets, because deregulated economies allow you to see information within these markets, see information within stock markets, see information within these companies, and disclose information, assess information, because the economy is literally run on information, and that's a good thing that you have in the US. So as to speak, you don't have to go looking for Greece's balance sheets, because that's a bad thing. Thirdly, we tell you that to a large extent, the reason why the US is so stable to a certain extent, and this is true, is through a self-fulfilling prophecy of the dollar being so big, right? And this is quite important, because what I posit to you here is that hypothetically, if you could make one country the home of the one standard currency, that would possibly be the best thing possible, idealistically. But here, the US is the best actor in this particular instance, rather than hedging it towards multiple actors, because that the US is the only country that has the dollar. It has the ability to go for things like loans and fiscal stimuluses, which does not have too much impact on its economy. The reason it's very important is because the 2008 financial crisis could have been far, far worse if the US generally did not have the ability to bail out so many companies and bail out its own, not bail out companies, but bail out its own economy so easily. And the COVID-19 crisis would have been so much worse. By the way, the COVID-19 crisis literally hit every economy in the world. In a hedged economic sense, you would have been far more fucked unless you did not rely on US. Because the reason Biden was able to give so easily fiscal stimulus checks to people was because of the fact that it had the backing of the US dollar, and he knew that the US dollar denomination is the most powerful in the world and it won't lose its value. Therefore, it was able to take loans from external actors because they know that the US loans are the most stable investment. It's pretty much a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because US dollar is so powerful, it allows itself to get out of recessions, in vast majority of cases not even get into recessions to begin with, and that's quite important in terms of controlling economies. Before I move on, I'll take one from closing government. OG?
Okay, your claim that the US is also on its own sometimes stable is missing the point. Our point is that other currencies also diversify in ways that the US doesn't, and the best way to hedge most structural risk is to hedge across many currencies rather than just one.
Amazing. What is the comparative in this particular instance? The comparative is, in vast majority of the cases, because of the way in which the economies are intertwined, first of all, if the US is in a crisis, almost certainly the euro is in a crisis because of the fact that they are so intertwined as an economy generally. In a lot of cases, I've already told you the structural problem with the Chinese economy. But the problem here is every economy, by the sense of economics, goes through a boom and bust cycle, right? At that particular point in time, would you rather hedge your bets on that one economy that you know can use the dollar to fortify its economy in multiple levels versus 5 or 6 currencies where you have no guarantee that these economies will be able to fortify their own economies through the ability of that singular currency? Because in those particular instances, the ability of having that singular currency is so very important that you lose out at the point in time you create a basket. The point at which Chinese economy goes into recession, there is no escaping from this. But when the US goes into recession, there is an easy way out in that particular sense. Lastly, in terms of why is it more important from the perspective of, say countries like Russia, and why we should essentially ban for countries like Ukraine, because the alternative is far worse in terms of geopolitics and so on and so forth. The Chinese and the Russians do not have as much accountability mechanisms as the US does in terms of geopolitics. If you want your ability to stop countries like Russia from going into war, penalize countries through a global standard that has essentially a global country that has things like democratic mechanisms within it, you want the US to have the dollar power, because otherwise literally most of the sanctions with Russia does not work, because a lot of countries including Europe want to trade with Russia at that point in time. The reason you can put so much pressure on Russia and the reason Ukraine hasn't given up on it yet is because of the simple fact that you could put so much pressure through the financial system. Without that, you're not able to do so within these countries, and you allow a lot of these problems within the world to persist. In the end, we have a far better economy and a far better world. The US dollar needs to persist. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. And to all 4 speakers in the top half. Moving on to the closing half of the debate, I'd like to welcome the member of government. Hear, hear.
Sorry, I have a lot of papers at once. I'll take POIs in the chat. If anyone, from Princeton or friends and family are watching, thank you for your support. And thank you, XK. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1, go. The problem with the US having global reserve currency status is it means the US is massively privileged with respect to any other country in the world through its financial system. People will always buy US bonds. The US will always be able to borrow for cheaper. US equities will always outperform other nations. In the worst case, we think if other countries get these benefits, we just redistribute towards Europe and China, which are in and of themselves relatively poor countries, but also nations all around the world whose finances have fled because people, when they have savings, want to go into the US equity market and buy US bonds and are much more likely to spend this money domestically. We literally make global development much more likely to happen. Why is this a prerequisite for the development of a large of the world? Under the status quo, the US has run a massive trade deficit for a very, very long time. If an ordinary country did this, this would lead to a massive increase in government debt and then a huge amount of inflation because people expect that the government is going to devalue the currency in order to be able to pay back the debt. The US has been able to maintain currency stability despite doing this, which is a massive win for them because a trade deficit means they get a bunch of stuff from abroad that goes to them. Everyone gets richer. US consumers are able to buy this stuff without the costs of having to do this. Why are they able to do this under the status quo? The first reason is because there is a huge demand for cash in US dollars. There is a massive demand for US bonds. So inflows of money to purchase US bonds means that there is not a massive deflation in the US currency because people are buying dollars and buying dollar denominated assets. The second reason, and the reason obviously they want cash is they execute transactions and because if other people want, if you believe that other people buy the US dollar, it is likely to be stable. Secondly, this as a consequence also makes US equities substantially more profitable, which means that other people are then much more likely to buy US equities as a consequence of this policy. Because A, the fact that the US is the global reserve currency means that it's substantially more stable than other currencies by my first mechanism, which means that the cost of borrowing in the United States is likely to be substantially lower than in other nations. The US has lower interest rates than almost everywhere around the world because of this massive demand for the bonds in market. Secondly, because when foreign people buy US bonds, and I think about like more than half of US debt is owned abroad, this pushes US bondholders into other forms of the economy like equities, which has a massive stimulating effect within the US country. But thirdly, because people also want incomes denominated in US dollars because they want foreign reserves, for instance, they are likely to buy US equities as opposed to anyone else. This in net amounts to a huge boon for the US economy at the expense of other people buying US companies and funding them instead of holding monies in other markets, people buying US bonds, funding government expansion at the cost of everywhere else in the world. What happens in the alternative? One, other countries, if there is likely to be pegging internationally to or holding foreign reserves that we think everyone admits is likely to happen, are likely to get a massive boost instead via exactly the same mechanisms. People will now buy European bonds. The cost of borrowing will go down in Europe. Europe will be able to fund more fiscal stimulus domestically, which is really good for the European economy. In the worst case, we just get countries like Japan and the EU getting access to these benefits, which are one, still poorer than the United States, so things we should care about. Two, much more likely to compete against the United States once they have this additional financial power, decreasing the extent to which any country is dependent on either China or the United States. But thirdly, have suffered massive stagnation in the last few years because people keep buying bonds, whereas now if you make the amount they get paid back substantially less because they get competition from abroad, you're much more likely to force people to spending this money domestically, which means that you're much more likely to stimulate these economies. Greece, Portugal, much likely to be better off. But even if not, the most likely way this is going to happen, and this is allowed within the rules of debating, is that people will buy RMB denominated bonds and Chinese government bonds because they will execute the vast majority of their transactions in the RMB. The reason this is likely is one, because China is currently the world's largest trader and has expanded into a huge number of countries internationally. So people do need to make sure specifically that they are able to hedge against deviations in the direction of the RMB, because that is the currency they denominate their contracts in. But secondly, because China has used some underhand tactics at times to try and enforce this globally. This means that China is the country that is actually benefiting from this motion at the expense of the United States. Why do we care about this? China is currently struggling quite a lot, right? The equity markets has always been relatively unstable for a variety of reasons. And as a consequence, it has been hard for them to respond to pretty much any financial shock, because if they ease capital controls and they reduce the amount that their bonds pay out, people will just flee the country. For instance, this is why in response to the most recent financial crisis, they could not reduce rates sufficiently to stimulate the economy because they were worried that everyone would just leave the country and start buying US bonds instead. We make it much more likely that China can finance expansion, that China can respond adequately to financial shocks. The reason we care, one, even if they fuck over the rest of the world, China has 1 billion people. 1/7 of the people in the world who are much poorer than anyone in Europe and the United States get a massive benefit because the Chinese government is now able to fund expansion. Chinese people are now able to import more to make their own lives better. I'll take the POI from open now.
Right. So you can see that the US has an ability to always maintain a stable dollar. In a point of economic crisis for small countries, they have different kinds of economic risk, one of which is currency risk. You concede that currency risk is eliminated. Is that not a good thing?
You did a good enough job of explaining it. You don't need to relitigate these points. I'll get on to stability later on. Secondly, we think that China specifically needs a large amount of additional funding to get out of the middle income trap that they currently face themselves in, and therefore a large amount of money that will enable them to upskill people domestically is actually necessary. But thirdly, China being wealthier means A, it is less likely to compete with other manufacturing countries, for instance, by devaluing its currency to make sure that it's not outcompeted with Vietnam because it's more able to pay people into relatively more skilled forms of this. And secondly, given it has very close ties to almost the rest of the world and much closer to the United States because it doesn't have isolationism to anywhere near the same degree, it is a much better candidate for purchasing exports from other countries. So China's additional wealth means that all of Southeast Asia gets a massive benefit because it's more likely to trade with these countries and they can buy stuff under their side of the house. But finally, countries that are now just less likely to hold any foreign reserves in general. And let's talk through this. The reason stability primarily matters is when your incomes are different from your expected costs in the future, right? Like you have to pay people domestically out in welfare, but the money you get from abroad is in a foreign currency and there might be some instability. The problem is, even if the US dollar is stable, if your currency is unstable relative to the US dollar, then that is still a massive problem for you. And sure, you can solve this problem with reserves, but notice the implicit cost of this is that people are just buying buying US bonds instead of spending the own money domestically. And it's not clear why that is a valid trade-off. Under our side, if you're trading with China, you're now much more likely to hold things like Chinese reserves. If you're trading the neighbor, you hold domestic reserves. It is unclear this makes a massive difference in stability because they also have some because you could also have an unstable domestic economy relative to the US, but the benefit is that we get a mass redistribution of financial power to these nations instead because people want assets in their currencies. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the member of opposition. You're here.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yep.
Awesome. All right. Usual stuff, POIs in the chat. You all know the drill by now. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's chat about two things. One, how China uses their currency. Two, how the US will react. Couple of important framing things to deal with first, to deal with some of the really odd claims coming from opening and CG. OG says, countries can choose what to peg their currency to. Wow, I know this is a grand final, but what a massive risk, Ateneo. As you correctly point out, your peg will be actual commodities that you need to keep in your reserve. It's not just a random number that you chose. So it looks like lots of foreign currency, for example, that themselves will be pegged to other randomly chosen actual commodity baskets. This means that the strength of your currency and the stability of your currency is determined by moving these commodities around, moving this basket around. This is the basis of having any kind of monetary control in the first place. So you cannot have everyone deciding for themselves what their basket is, because how will you move these commodities around to ensure that your currency is stable if the country that you're moving this commodity to has a different peg than you? This is why the gold standard failed and why commodities are now tied to the USD, because physical commodities just don't work in creating a good economic monetary system. The alternative, therefore, will trickle down to one competing currency and one currency that becomes the hegemon. And the reason for this is because there needs to be some kind of standardization in international capital flows. Maybe you can accommodate 2 or 3 currencies for a while, but you're likely to homogenize over one international standard eventually, because that's what makes life a lot more convenient for you in ensuring that you are able to more conveniently access international markets, international capital flows. Note, therefore, that the long term is that you probably give China the same advantages that the CG says that the US currently has. Why is the yuan the most likely option? First, the rise of massive foreign investment from China. Trade happens in the yuan when it comes to the BRI project, the Asian Investment Development Fund push. All these transactions happen in the yuan. That's why it's likely to be more powerful than any other currency out there. Second, the fact that China has an incentive, right? State-owned enterprises want to move out of China to cool the Chinese domestic economy. Other economies like Europe doesn't have the same overheating, especially not the EU, where most of Central Europe exists, that still have massive demand that the EU can still tap into. All does zero work to prove that the yuan is the currency of choice. We do. Let's talk about how and why China controls its currency and whether that's likely to change even if they gain more leverage in the international monetary system. Why do they control their currency? One, stability. China escaped the AFC in the late 1990s because they had tight monetary controls, and therefore historically, China has seen protection of their currency as the precipitation of growth. Second, political control. It does not trust the international world order. It prefers to ensure that it has more control over its country than not. Third, it is still largely reliant on manufacturing and production and will likely continue to do so in the future because there is a huge demand still for Chinese products, because things like MNC networks already do exist for things like fast fashion. Manufacturing will continue to exist in China in a large degree. Why is all of this important? Because the desire to control the yuan is probably likely to get even worse in a world where the yuan becomes the currency of choice. One, because there'll be less easy ways to devalue the yuan. The current easy way that China adopts is to keep buying US Treasury bonds. Presumably, if China is the international dominant currency, they can no longer do that in order to ensure that their currency doesn't strengthen. Second, the yuan is more subject to the whims of international economies, which scares the government because they do not want to be subject to these international pressures. This has already winded up in the status quo, with China engaging in weird economic innovation, and I use innovation in a very negative way. Shit like quantitative easing that China has started to experiment with just earlier this year. This is massively risky if countries decide that this is the currency that they want to conduct capital transactions with, because it increases the likelihood of bad Chinese contagion. The Chinese government hasn't exactly made fantastic economic decisions in the last 10 years, which is exactly why they are in the shit that CG points out that they are in. I don't think, therefore, that reliance on the Chinese economy and Chinese government's economic decisions are the best way to conduct international capital transactions and have a strong currency that can actually act as the international backer for the rest of the world. This is therefore the necessary comparative that OO doesn't want to engage with versus the stability of the USD, which we accept OO's arguments for, but they have done no comparative in this debate. I want to add that even when the US does actually do rogue things, which is the government's worst case scenario, this tends to be corrected by the democratic process that happens every 4 years. OO has no comparative and no proven counterfactual. They are out of this debate. Let's talk about geopolitics. How will America react? The answer is that they'll react badly. And the reason for this is because losing reliance on the global dollar is a signal of decreasing US influence. This is the one area that Democrats and Republicans all agree on, is that you don't want to fucking lose influence to China. This also flips CG, because CG says the US is incredibly privileged. We agree. They have done all the stuff like trade deficits that CG talks about. But the point here is, if this has been part of the US's economic strategy for the longest time, this change in the international status quo is a massive threat to the US insofar as it affects the way that their economic strategy plays out in ensuring that the US continues to grow economically in the future. Also, they don't want to lose control of their allies to China, right? Because the country with the biggest bloc economically has incredible power in shaping what the international order looks like, what the rules-based world order looks like. This is something that the US doesn't want to cede to China. Also, security threats, right? The Asia-Pacific region encroachment by China against some of the US's most important allies in Japan and South Korea is of incredible importance to the US. Before I want to explain what America will try and do, OG, sure.
It is not clear that there is forced to be one currency, since the competitive process of taking on new currencies leads to the favorable trade policies in integral capital we talk about, much better than the colonial.
Okay, so the point here is you might have some competition in the mid-term or the short term, but eventually the fact that investors, banks always want to have the most convenient, less costly economic transactions means that you're always going to default back to one currency in the long term anyway. Okay, so what will America do? First, they cannot subsidize their firms to the same degree without relying on the same devaluation that China is using that China currently uses to subsidize firms. Therefore, their only option is to threaten these countries in other ways. Note, the US still has massive financial capacity. A lot of countries, especially in the American and European region, trade the most with the US. This means that they're likely to preemptively sanction countries to consolidate their economic bloc. This is a flip on OG's multilateralism argument. And it's especially true in countries where the cost of switching is currently high because they already have lots of US foreign reserve currently, and they already peg their economy to the US. If the US senses that China is going to be on the rise, the likely outcome as a result is that they're going to try and consolidate these partners and form an economic bloc around these partners by threatening them, saying that if you do switch to the Chinese current currency, to the yuan, there's going to be lots of repercussions, lots of implications towards your trade deals with the US. This means that small countries, but also mid-sized countries, will end up being forced to choose between America and China, creating the bipolar world order that we had experienced in the 1980s and 90s and sending all of us back to the Cold War. I think that forcing countries to choose is a terrible option insofar as right now countries have the ability to leverage between the US and China in a way that they wouldn't be able to do when you consolidate blocks in the way that will happen only on government. Okay, that's my time. I'm the proud beneficiary of the love and support from so many friends, families, people I care about, and inspirations from the Singapore circuit that have paved the way for this to even be possible. To them, I'm eternally grateful. For them, I oppose.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the last speaker on the Gov side, the government whip.
I'd like for people to give me POIs visually only. And for that reason, I'd also appreciate it if judges and speakers would all just have their cameras on. It makes the debate happier and better. Our extension is about development, the betterment of human quality of life for millions of people across the globe. our claim is that US growth is turbocharged by the dominance of the dollar at the expense of the economies of other countries. In the absence of the dollar hegemony, these benefits disperse amongst other states. And note that this applies regardless of what the counterfactual is, whether it's the renminbi, whether it's a basket of different currencies. And I think that if you're questioning how to resolve that clash, it's quite good that our clash is independent of that. But this is also really, really massive, right? Because it truly is to the tune of trillions of dollars. Half of US denominated foreign debt is held by foreign actors. That's like $14 trillion that are currently held by these foreign actors. And I think that when this goes to other people, it's just like a huge amount of financial stimulus. But the second main thing is just it's also the case that note that upside cannot support the enrichment and growth of developing countries. The reason for this is because this is a trend that is already happening because the US returns are currently so stable because people often invest in them rather than in their own economy. But there is a trend towards investing more domestically as stability increases and people get wealthier and it's easier to invest abroad. And therefore, the enriching and development of developing countries inherently comes with a decrease of US currency hegemony. The bottom line is this: the US has a lot of money. That's not great. We would rather go to other countries. Why is that so beneficial? For a couple of reasons, right? The first thing is just like very, very simply, when people default to investing domestically, buying equity domestically, buying government bonds in their own currency, that's really, really good because it gives local governments more to work with. And note that monetary policy is not really effective in the absence of government spending that is fiscal to back that up. But second of all, it's also just the case that it's also just the case that you also make it such that countries become much more stable due to increased democratization and access to foreign capital. And that means that they're also less susceptible to shocks in domestic financial conditions, and the rate of return to domestic investments was also substantially higher. What does this mean on the ground? It means that it's easier for people to set up businesses because they borrow at a rate of 2% rather than 5%, or because the currency that is used within their own region is something that is regional as opposed to something in the US that they have to buy because it's so in high demand and therefore relatively expensive. But the second main thing is it's also just the case that we substantially increase the well-being of the Chinese economy. And the reason for this is because right now, we think that the Chinese government is actually not doing great. It's stagnating, and it really, really needs all of this investment. And that's for two reasons. The first is growth is currently really, really slowing. The middle income trap means that China's lost the main comparative advantage that it previously used to become richer, and it increasingly becomes poor and poor. It has supply over capacities, for example, like billions of dollars placed into state enterprises that invest primarily in steel or in infrastructure that currently have no demand and therefore completely wasted. It's also just the case that Chinese growth in the past was reliant on state-owned enterprises and government-planned economy and investment, which is currently proving to be less and less effective because an underlying lack of faith in the Chinese government means that as soon as someone gets rich, they put their money into US bonds, US capital, US homes instead. And for those reasons, China is getting poorer and poorer and entering more and more debt. Growth is slowing, and that's really, really bad. Why is this more important than the other impacts in the round? For a couple of reasons here. The first thing is, I think what Greg's told you about the certainty of development and how money goes into domestic countries and spreads much more evenly across the world is much more certain and likely to occur than the links given in Top Off, which are mostly about stability, about financial crisis, which honestly, I don't think are that important in the round. The first reason being, look, I think Ello points this out reasonably well. Stability, financial crisis is a bit of an edge case scenario. There are lots of reasons why they can be quite bad. And I think the government, the word is already integrated to an extent that it's not really clear why this particular mode of dollar hegemony makes it so much worse. But the second main reason for this is because it limits the OG's impacts to one, countries that have their currencies pegged to the US dollar, which is actually not that many countries in the world. Two, it also means that their efficacy is limited to monetary policy. And I think that I said this earlier, that is fine, monetary policy is not very effective when you don't have fiscal policy. But the reason is this, right? Monetary policy works because when you lower interest rates, you hope that people decide to take risks and spend more money and take out loans. The problem is, all of that is secondary to your faith in the recovery of your economy overall and your perceptions of how much money people have to spend and whether the economy will be better off overall. Therefore, in times of financial crisis, no matter how low you make the interest rate, people are not going to borrow and help you. And therefore, you really, really need government fiscal stimulus, which is why it's so very important. Why, as Greg says, we tell you why the benefits of having a global currency is diffused amongst everyone across the world. Okay, so I think that's a reason as to why financial crisis has a secondary impact on the ground. But I also want to chat about stability, right? Because maybe it's just my small brain, but it is truly mysterious to me why stability occupies such a large part of the top half debate. Because the link between having currency reserves held in a particular currency and the stability of your own currency is kind of indirect. Foreign reserves help because you can buy and sell bonds in your own currency to control the exact level which it is at. It is not hung on the levels of value that your currency reserves are currently in, as long as you can moderate the amount that you're buying or selling at any given point in time, which means that honestly, as long as you keep some degree of foreign reserves, seems probably fine to me. That stability is probably not super important. But the second main thing is it's just also the case that stability is affected far more by domestic financial conditions, which we uniquely tell you about. The second thing I want to do then, in terms of weighing, is just explain to you why it's comparatively so much better to have money in the hands of other governments that are not the US, for two reasons, right? The first is it's used to a much larger extent because so much of US investment goes to military as opposed to other countries that don't have the dependence on this military hegemony and therefore have a tendency to spend it on other things such as development. But the second thing is that it's also just the case that China is way poorer than the US. And I think for those reasons, the marginal utility of this money is also better on our side. Finally, on China bad, China good. I think the main issue that they say is they assume that Chinese power is quite bad. I would posit that Chinese aggression is driven primarily by insecurity, i.e., China is more expansionist in the South China Sea when they feel like they're under threat. And I think that when the Chinese economy is much more better off, it also reduces their need to use manipulative measures to control other currencies. I also think it's the case that right now we are at a status quo where the US is highly dominant. And I think in a world where lots of different currency blocks are using different currencies, it also means that there's greater accountability placed on the Chinese government and a need to please other countries as well. For all those reasons, we make people substantially richer, and for those reasons, CG.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the last speaker of the debate of the tournament as a whole, the opposition whip.
Right, hi, can you hear me?
Yep, nice and clear.
Thanks, take away. Yeah, before I start, I want to thank the Singapore circuit and US specifically for taking care of me for honestly so many years. And also I want to state my amusement that I'm the last person you are going to hear these championships. Right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think there were two important contributions from Dion's speech that aren't dealt with by the closing government. The first is an explanation of why Chinese use of currency specifically is economically volatile. Secondly is an explanation of why geopolitically this leads to drastically worse outcomes in the interim, but also moving forward. Let's talk about economics. I want to note that the discussion in abstract makes no sense for a few reasons. First, it drastically undercuts the value of closing gulf. Because closing gulf ends up in a position where they say, well, we'll benefit some countries and a variety of countries, but each of them presumably will benefit a lot less in a world where this is done in the abstract, as OG wants to do by saying, well, other random currencies might increase in value. But secondly, I want to note that this abstract discussion of multiple different currencies is unrealistic for the reasons Dion gives you, and for the reasons, incidentally, that opening opposition don't give you. There are a few things that Dion says. The first thing he points out is that only China can trample the economic rule book in a way that would enable them to become the main currency and therefore capitalize on the decline of the dollar. The reason for this is in the status quo, SWIFT's market advantage, as OG characterized, is significant, but only China will be able to trample on these economic rules to make CIPS the alternate global transfer or significant transfer actor. But further to that, also I want to note that China uniquely has the capacity to trample on companies' wishes. These companies that have the incentive to maintain status quo that work for them, relatively large companies. That's something the EU and Japan, for example, don't have the power to do. What that means is that uniquely, it's likely that China is the alternative. I also want to note that constant change is unlikely to be possible because like the degree to which you need, like reserve currency is one thing, but the reliance also looks at the reliance on the currency for trade and the level of difficulty and like cost that is incurred asking people to have multiple different trading like payment systems or to change between different payment systems radically as per different policies happening, economic policies happening in each country is so significant that countries are unlikely to be able to do this, or the cost of the extent to which they change is very limited. That deals with OG's claim that you increase the agency of countries to be able to play different risks. The third, when all say that you don't know the next step, therefore, like of China and Russia, the problem is that that reason was unclear in terms of why the US uniquely is known in terms of what the next step is. That's why the centerpiece of the discussion has to be on why China is specifically bad. And that's analysis that was given to you by Dion, not responded to in the government whip speaker. The final thing I want to note within the economic clash is to deal with closing government, because closing gov says, let's redistribute money drastically, and this is going to be a good thing. I have broadly like 4 responses. The first is that it's not true that you get an increase in money. And the reason for this is that if they really have a basket, what that means is that in that basket, you risk countries shifting money around, and consequently that means that by OG's logic there's a risk to any investment that you get in closing government because they might not want to buy your bonds in the future. That insecurity limits any degree of economic change and development that closing government wants to claim happens. That also means that that takes out the argument that China will magically be more secure because China presumably might fear that it might reduce the amount of inflows that go to it might reduce moving forward. Secondly, I want to note that this argument weighs really weakly against every other team for 2 reasons. First, that this is likely to go to other middle to rich countries like Japan, like they suggested. These countries have fairly strong economies. I do not see the value of increasing these economies more. The reason why this is structurally going to go to other strong economies is because you don't want to use a weak economy as your peg or any part of your peg for the reasons that are given by all other teams in the debate, right? Which is that exposes you to a significant degree of risk. But more than that, countries have so many other ways to grow. In addition to this idea of inflows coming as a result of fiat from the policy, I think that therefore there is no tipping point to this particular argument. But thirdly, at best, what they do is they create more regional inequality as opposed to one single actor being significantly stronger, i.e. the US. That's not a good thing because it means that for countries that operate as like in relatively equal playing fields within their particular region, that means that these countries suddenly lose out. The amount of trade that they were able to get previously, because regionally it makes more sense to trade within that region rather than with the US, reduces, and so that regional inequality is going to hurt small countries even more. Before I move on, I want to take opening government.
Stability is not mutually exclusive nor an a priori good when it's disaligned with the country's economic policy. Why is picking between the US and China better than the competitive incentives we provide for big countries to develop small countries in order for them to adopt their currency?
I got that. So apart from Dion's analysis, I want to note as a final note on this economics thing that it doesn't matter. And the reason for that is that in the long term, it's likely that countries will find ways to cope with the new economic environment that exists. So on balance, no one is going to get a big win here. Let's talk about geopolitics, therefore, because like GovWhip just doesn't deal with this at all. The big argument that was given in Dion is that in the immediate interim, the US isn't going to just sit back and allow its currency to decline because of the massive geopolitical and economic benefit that CG suggests it is able to benefit from in the status quo. What that means is that they are likely to react by trying to coerce countries to keep itself strong. OG has a throwaway line on this that says competition. The problem is that US will recognize that it can't compete with China. One, because China has the ability to give extreme subsidies to its companies and to other countries that the US just doesn't have the ability to throw money around because they recognize WTO rules, for example, against subsidies, but also because the US economy is and their ability to activate random money out of nowhere is a lot lesser than China's ability to use state-owned banks, for example. What this means is that you're likely to get more coercive measures that Dion tells you, like sanctions or like significant diplomatic pressure. 4 reasons why this is the most important. First, because it's the big argument, the biggest likelihood in the debate, the most immediate outcome, because it happens in the immediate interim as this trend happens. Secondly, it is the least mitigatable as a consequence, not just now, but in the future because of the bipolarity that is created. Third, because the comparative harm of economic outcomes are all market forces, which means that different actors have the ability to correct within the market. Vis-a-vis one actor specifically trying to manipulate the market to screw over smaller countries, that is a lot harder for you to mitigate, and that is a lot harder for you to react to and defend against. But fourthly, this has just a massive, massive impact. Countries, especially small countries, are going to lose the short-term capacity of agency as a result of this policy because of the sanctions that are placed under. But in the long run, the bipolar world that Dion tells you is really important as well. Because what he tells you first and foremost is that the Cold War context weakens sanctions, because if you always have a major backer like China or the US, there is a world in which you don't have to be scared of the other side's sanctions. That means that there's no way whatsoever to enforce any degree of global policing of actions on that side of the house. I want to note that China increasing its economic power is probably bad because it removes the existing incentive towards moderation in order for it to grow its economy in other ways. In contrast, multipolarity means that even if you make sanctions work, that is slow and time consuming because you have to get so many actors to agree. In a context where geopolitics moves fast and within days, the ability to sanction before, for example, Russia can move assets out of US banks is really important. But also the implication of cross sanctions between different blocs that makes countries significantly poorer on that side of the house, because you're going like the Eastern Bloc, for example, tries to sanction the Western Bloc because they're trading in different currencies. What that means is on that side, countries get poorer on net, but also our ability to police the global environment decreases drastically. That's why we oppose.
Thank you very much. And in fact, thank you to all the teams in the round. One big metaphorical round of applause. Well, what happens now is, I presume the stream stops. You guys leave the room. We deliberate as we would, and hopefully after a period of time,